This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 31, We Meet Mr. Molotov. Butler was a bright and well-read kid, and this became increasingly apparent to us as he entered his early teen years. He was forever coming up with interesting information that he discovered in books. I could only imagine he was spending his free time in the reference section of the library. So obscure and unusual was the collection of information he would haphazardly share. A small group of us might be in the middle of the street, sitting on our stingrays, when Butler would walk up and offer some interesting nugget on some completely random subject. He did this more than once. Did we know that the sun may have actually flamed out within the last 10 minutes? Gone. We peered skyward. But it's not all bad. Because of the constraints levied by the speed of light and the gigantic intergalactic distances it had to traverse, we would not be in total blackness for perhaps another 10 minutes. Bitter cold temperatures would arrive in but a few days. Within weeks, the entire Earth would be a frozen tundra, covered by many feet of solid ice. We wouldn't need our stingrays anymore. Stuff like this was Butler's forte. Thus, it was that day when we were doing just that, sitting in the street in front of my house on our bikes, talking about pretty much nothing, when Butler walked across the path between the neighbors' houses that served as a major thoroughfare for our crew. After a simple greeting, he suggested we concoct something called a Molotov cocktail. We said that sounded like a good plan, since we were hot and thirsty. Is it cold and quenching and sweet? I asked. Well, it could be served in a Coca-Cola bottle, he said, with a sly smirk. We headed for my garage. Yakoslav Mikhailovich Molotov is the guy that this particular cocktail was named after. He was a premier in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The Finns were not fond of this man, and they had their reasons. He insisted on bombing them with increasing frequency. Molotov was in cahoots with the Germans at the time, and they were both harassing the Finns in a never-ending quest to get more of what they already had quite a lot of, land and natural resources. When asked by the free media what he was dropping on the Finns, Molotov suggested that they were not bombs at all, but bread baskets. Molotov was not the power-hungry Stalinist creep that many claimed, though he worked for Stalin at the time. He insisted the Finns and the media had it all wrong. He was actually a humanitarian. Along the way, the Finns developed their own method of fighting back. Short on industry, but long on creativity and spunk, they came up with a handheld incendiary device one could make out of materials found in any home. To accompany the Molotov bread baskets the Finns were receiving from the Russians, they invented a complimentary beverage, the Molotov cocktail. The Finns threw these fiery little menaces at Russian and German tanks whenever they spotted one. The Molotov cocktail is often misunderstood. It is not a bomb, but rather an improvised incendiary device, IID. A bomb is contained through an extremely intense chemical reaction occurring at supersonic speed. The expansion of gases occurs with such force that it blows apart the container that holds it, with potentially catastrophic results. In contrast, a Molotov cocktail does not blow up at all. It just appears to. It's kind of like a bomb in reverse, sort of like what a calzone is to a pizza. With a Molotov, a flammable material, usually gasoline, is placed inside a breakable vessel with some kind of a wick, usually in the form of a rag stuffed tightly in the top. The vessel is sealed. When the wick is lit and the device hurled and smashed against something hard enough to break it open, the flammable liquid inside is released and the wick ignites it with an impressive and fiery display. When we saw our first demo of a Molotov cocktail, we were, blown away. There before us was a conflagration that resembled a 5-foot-tall nuclear bomb. To any pyrotechnic junkie, it was a glorious thing to behold. A Molotov cocktail will not blow anything up, but it will destroy all kinds of things with the ensuing burning liquid. The broken glass makes a real mess, too. It arrives with dramatic effect as it tumbles quietly through the air with its flaming fuse, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a deep whoomph upon impact. A brilliant fireball and burning gas emitting thick black smoke completes the presentation. It's an unsettling event, and anyone nearby will certainly be impressed. For its ease of production, alarming visual impact, low cost, and damaging results, the Molotov cocktail has become the device of choice for most violent protesters and riotous gangs the world over. Inside my garage, Butler and I quickly downed a warm Coca-Cola. The thick glass bottle that held the delightful refreshment would be ideal, he told us. Next, we grabbed the gas can that always stood next to the big red Toro. We ever so carefully filled a bottle about 3/4 of the way, having been around gasoline our entire young lives and having ignited the stuff on occasion. With first-hand knowledge and plenty of near misses, we clearly understood just how flammable it was. I ran into the kitchen and scrounged around under the sink for some of Essie's rags. I just needed a medium-sized piece made of smooth cotton like an old t-shirt, Butler told me. With 4 young boys in the house, we had plenty of those. Bubbling with excitement, I was back out through the kitchen door in a flash. Now came the tricky part. Butler explained that the wick had to be large enough to fit tightly into the bottle opening and down inside an inch or so. This took a few attempts, but after twisting the rag like a corkscrew, we got it right. Just then, Essie opened the kitchen door and sashayed down the steps to get some laundry out of the dryer. She asked what we were up to, and we told her we were just making a Molotov cocktail. She laughed and went on her way. Essie likely had no idea what we were talking about. Soon, her basket brimming with fresh, warm clothes, she sauntered barefoot back up the steps into the kitchen and shut the door. We smiled at one another. With cocktail in hand, the next step was to determine the best place for the inaugural test. Because the bottle had to strike a hard surface, it was either the driveway or the road. Certainly, we would not be pitching it against the side of the house. Butler concluded the road seemed risky. It was late afternoon, and we were in full view of the neighbors. At the end of our driveway, in front of our carport, a tall and full hibiscus hedge created a natural barrier in front of an asphalt parking area behind it. It was a turnaround of sorts that Dad used to back up from the carport when he left the house on errand runs. Except for Dr. Brown's view from his patio, it was quite private. We rarely even saw Dr. Brown, so it was highly unlikely he would be watching us that afternoon. The location was set. The small crew hurried over to the launching pad. Butler held the Molotov cocktail upside down for a moment so the rag could start to become saturated with a little gasoline. This would help it light and keep it lit as he hurled it through the air, he reported. Years later, I learned this was the quick and dirty way to create a wick, and the most dangerous way as well. Gasoline is extremely flammable and should never, ever be poured on any material and lit. The vapors are incredibly explosive, and the flames travel much faster than any kid can run. Launch time. I would light, Butler would launch. Standing off to the grass on the side of the asphalt pad, we paused a moment to again scan the area to ensure privacy and also confirm no life forms, other than the crew, were near the strike zone. Butler held the cocktail back over his shoulder and I lit the tip of the rag with a wooden match. Gasoline infused, it puffed immediately into full flame, surprising us both. With flames dancing around his wavy blonde hair, he waited a moment that felt like a long time and hurled the Molotov cocktail skyward in a high, tumbling arc. The deep whoomph sound when it hit the driveway and ignited was almost more appealing than the 5-foot-tall fireball that erupted instantly, but not quite. At the point of impact, we had a smashed Coca-Cola bottle and a burning puddle of gasoline spewing forth large flames and jet-black smoke. We all looked at Butler. Our expressions implored, "Now what?" During his research on the Molotov cocktail, he had apparently departed the reference library immediately following the making and throwing of an IID, and right before the part about dealing with the aftermath. Of what to do with the remnants, he was uncertain. I was impressed, having been introduced to a brand new, incredibly exciting incendiary device. No mail-order chemicals, no bomb fuse, and no mom. I was elated and nervously excited with all the potential applications, but also sobered by the fact that this was not a bomb at all, but a device that started fires. How and when to deploy it would take considerable planning and thought. I decided at that moment to try it out that very night, as soon as darkness fell. I had the perfect location. After dinner, I headed out into the garage and assembled my first Molotov. I quickly guzzled an 8-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola. I reminded myself to be meticulous and beyond careful in all that I did, making sure that there was absolutely no spillage and the rag was well secured down into the neck of the bottle. I smelled gas, but assumed this came with the territory. With the cocktail obscured secretly in my hand, off I trotted in the dark to Dinkle's. We met in front of Dork's house. No moon shone, so the shrubs lining the street were black. Dinkle stepped soundlessly from the shadows. We headed up the neighbor's driveway directly across the street. The family that owned this property made for an interesting and somewhat mysterious group. A gorgeous Scottish clan with 6 children. They were all at once beautiful and handsome. Every year we received a Christmas card with a photo of the entire brood, and it was affixed to our refrigerator religiously with a magnet until it could be replaced by next year's version. This picture really perked up the kitchen. The father owned a very successful produce company and, based on their spectacularly landscaped and manicured grounds, he did quite well. He was a big chap, gregarious and full of charm. He was known to throw down a Scotch now and then. I was completely smitten with at least 2 of his beautiful daughters. At least 2. There were 3. This family was a bit mysterious in that none of the children ever really mingled with the neighborhood crew. They were the right age and lived right in the middle of it all, but rarely were they out in the streets in a social setting. I didn't think much about it then, but today I wonder what that was all about. My guess was that their parents had another plan for them, and neighborhood interaction with our gang was not part of it. I believe I now understand why. On their side yard, which abutted Dinkle's, was a 15-foot-high promontory providing a commanding view of the street that passed below, Rock Garden Lane. We concluded that it would be an ideal plan to launch the cocktail off the promontory in front of an oncoming car. To get this right, our timing had to be spot on. There would be no practice. We had only a single attempt. Dinkle and I figured it would scare the hell out of the driver. Done deal. We had the cocktail. All we needed was the target. We crouched in the dark next to a small decorative hedge, cocktail and matches at the ready. Time inched along. Dinkle's patio screen door suddenly swung open, and we jumped. Out walked Butler. Even in the dark, he could make out our forms on our knees next to the small hedge. He approached and asked what we were doing. I held up the Molotov cocktail and grinned. He shook his head, mumbled that we were both crazy, and slipped away into the neighbor's yard. Rock Garden Lane was not a pass-through street. Cars that drove down it were local, usually someone who lived on the street or, at most, a few blocks over and was heading home after a night out. As far as cars driving through, there was really only one other possibility. Dinkle spotted the headlights first as the target cruised slowly along the adjacent street and turned right onto Rock Garden Lane. It headed directly down the hill toward us. We were Cherokee Indians high up on the cliff, and the stagecoach was now bouncing down the trail below, right into our ambush and direct line of fire. Our arrows were notched and ready, our bows fully drawn. The car was not moving very quickly, as one would expect of someone trying to get somewhere. Instead, it prowled slowly down the hill and past Dinkle's driveway. Time to move. We assumed our positions. Dinkle struck a match and lit the wick. I quickly arched back my arm and let the cocktail sail. It was a perfect pitch, and I was most impressed as it tumbled up through the dark sky. We watched, holding our breaths, as it completed its arc and began to fall toward the front of the approaching police car. My placement was beyond reproach. It landed, broke, and erupted with an impressive mushroom of flames. A dull pop, the tinkling sound of broken glass, and a whoomph was followed by the sound of roaring flames and the screeching of skidding tires. It exploded directly in front of the green and white cruiser, illuminating in full detail the stunned officer's face inside. He slammed on the brakes and lit up his siren and flashing lights. How often does an officer driving on a quiet night through suburban South Miami in 1967 become confronted with a Molotov cocktail hurled within a few feet of his car? I looked to the left to see Dinkle's face aglow from the flaming gas below. Expecting he might faint right on the spot, he instead spun around and exploded up out of our bunker. With me on his tail, we were both flying through his backyard at a pace we never before imagined. We ran so fast that it felt like we left the ground at times, and probably we did. And then Dinkle was gone. A neighbor's clothesline, forgotten and unseen, garroted him. No worries. Young and flexible, he was up and flying again in a flash. In a matter of seconds, we were both across Pine Needle Lane and heading up the low hill into dark backyards and neighborhoods beyond. For all we knew, we had just incinerated an officer of the law in his cruiser, and we were completely shocked and terrified. This was an egregious lapse of judgment beyond anything we could have imagined. We were clearly a couple of complete idiots. Dinkle and I stayed out in the pitch dark of night for hours. There were sirens in the distance that came and went. We were sure we heard police choppers hovering overhead. What had we done? What had we done? We cowered in a hedge late into the night and ever so quietly discussed the craziness of our act. Had we just blown up a police car in front of his house? If so, we had a major problem. This was clearly out of control. We were subdued, scared to death, and very tired. Dinkle's neck was killing him, and I could make out a serious bruise from the whip-lashing clothesline, even in the dark. Dried sweat chilled our bodies. We shivered, and our teeth chattered. In the wee hours, we crept slowly back towards our neighborhood, nervous and quite depressed, with no idea what had transpired after we fled the area. I had heard of reform school and now began to wonder what it would be like. I kept asking myself how my life could be over at such a young age. The neighborhood was deathly silent. Dinkle turned left in front of Dork's house to head home, and I trotted up and across the cut-through path to mine. There was no sleep that night. I tossed and turned as I lay in bed imagining my bleak future. Youth lost, while imprisoned in a tiny, grim cell, surrounded by a gang of other juvenile delinquents. Certainly many would be tougher and meaner than I. A life of promise had been squandered in just a few moments of errant judgment. Every car that passed the house brought a start and a couple of extra heartbeats, as I expected each to be an approaching squad car coming to take me away. The next day broke bright and sunny. I awoke from a light doze early, feeling tired and weary, and raced over to Dinkle's, avoiding the scene of the act by cutting up through the Scottish clan's driveway and around through his backyard. I found him in his kitchen, with his mom whipping up some breakfast, an egg in a hole. She made them on occasion, and they were the best breakfasts I ever had. Dinkle's mom was truly an outstanding cook, when she cooked, which, unfortunately, was rare. We were starving and ate quietly, saying little. After wolfing down our eggs in a hole, we headed outside and walked gingerly down his driveway to the street in front of his yard. I nervously asked him en route if he had heard anything. Not a single word was his reply. Nothing. A massive sense of relief swept through my body. I was almost overcome as my stomach clenched and my knees wobbled. There, about 10 feet from his mailbox, we examined the remnants of the prior night's Molotov cocktail, a large blackened blotch in the road with shards of broken glass on both sides where the cleanup crew had swept them. As we poked around, evidence continued to confirm that we had not, in fact, incinerated either an officer of the law or his trusty police cruiser. Apparently, we had just shocked, frightened, and most certainly impressed him. Dinkle and I shuffled around in the gravel of his car park and silently contemplated what we had almost done the night before. Even though the bright sun rode high overhead and puffy white clouds drifted by, we were still stunned and quite subdued, unable to escape another dark cloud seemed to hover above. In silence, we both knew what we were both thinking. Holy shit. It's 1969. Mom and Dad decide to move 3 cars, 4 boys, 3 Yorkshire Terriers, and at least 1 cat from Miami to Seattle. What? Chapter 32 is up next, and it's called Seattle Experiment.